Hey y'all, this is Sam with the Roots of Change podcast, and we are back with Joe Cardillo. And this week we are talking about how the US government is being run like a tech company and what we should do about it. So, welcome, Joe. Welcome back.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. And yeah, what a weighty topic it is.
How are you doing in the midst of things?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I think there is this kind of this sort of running stream of information, which, we've talked about this before, but like there's a flood the zone strategy that's happening. And, so I'm limiting my news consumption and just trying to take care of myself and people around me. And also just recognizing that, like, there is a difference between the things that are being said and the things that are being done. And
Mm,
it's important to make that distinction. So that's helping me stay sane. And hopefully you're having some version of that yourself.
yes, really doing that as well. We had a really great media consumption workshop last week about just how to balance all of that, how to get kind of the top headlines, understand what's going on so that you can do your work while also, protecting your sanity, because a lot of this is noise and it's designed to overwhelm us. So really, it's like, what are the key components that are important to me in my work? But would love to get into the topic. We wanted to kind of start out just talking about, first what does it mean for the U.S. government to be run like a tech company? Like, how are these tech companies being run? We've shared just a little bit of our background in the past. I have worked in advertising and marketing for over 15 years, and I have intimately seen a lot of the big tech changes over those years, working with some of the top financial banks in the country, big tech companies. So that's where I'm coming from. And Joe, I know you have similar experiences too.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in venture-backed startups from around 2013 to 2023, so like a solid decade of, basically being in or around Silicon Valley. And I did live in San Francisco for a couple of years, and kind of in that startup world, and am, pretty familiar with sort of how things work from the smaller, startup all the way up to some of the bigger ones. It's not like I worked at Google or Meta, Facebook, et cetera, but certainly familiar with those folks and have also worked with people who worked at or were leading in those environments. So I kind of know the thought process and the habits pretty well as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to kick it off and just kind of share a little bit, like, what are some of the components to how tech companies are run and how that is, detrimental to the US government?
Yeah, let me give a little sketch. I mean, I think you're going to be able to add some context, but the things that come up, I'll sort of describe a few things that I think are really important, and they're coming to bear in this moment with Elon Musk and his sort of skeleton crew of hackers who are, running amok and basically taking and redirecting taxpayer funds. So going back to sort of the startup experience that I've had, there are some components like, first of all, founders are sort of glorified in Silicon Valley. Sometimes that is put through the lens of doers, like we're the doers and the makers, right? That's a common kind of phrase that you would hear. So founders are sort of glorified, um, as being the ones who go out there and take the risks and build something new. And sometimes that's true, but a lot of times it's just, your dad's trust fund or your uncle's guy at Goldman Sachs knows a guy. So these are not necessarily people who are taking risk because they're innovative or bright. Sometimes they're just taking the risk because they can. So there's that kind of founder glorification, and there's definitely some confirmation bias in that process for sure. A lot of times you also see in the kind of the tech and the venture capital backed environment, there's this obviously this sort of move fast and break things. I would extend that sort of metaphor to, like, we don't fix things unless they're going to make us money. So there are no startup companies that are backed by venture capitalists that will fix a long form problem like ADA accessibility on a sidewalk unless there's money to be made. And in a lot of cases, there isn't money to be made. So like ADA is a good example because the government is responsible for accessibility, so that you and me and maybe an elderly person in our life we're caring for, or someone who has a temporary or a chronic disability. If they are not going to make money, or they're not a profit opportunity for a startup or tech, they're not going to address it, right? So that's another kind of key fundamental piece. I think the other thing that often comes to bear is this sort of like all knowing, all seeing surveillance that comes with those things that I'm mentioning, which is like if the founder wants to make a dashboard that can peer into any part of the company and look at any of the data and look at the users' videos, photos, direct messages, most private, sensitive health information, they're just going to do it. That's the ethos of that tech world and that startup world, and they're going to do it whether whether they have the right to, or it's legal or it's ethical. And so those are the kinds of, there's a lot of other things, but those are the kinds of habits and norms in that environment that we are also now seeing with Elon Musk and his sort of crew of hackers going in and just sort of screwing with taxpayer funds and sensitive taxpayer data, and like they're just kind of treating it like their own personal playground in the way that they are used to treating customers, employees, and users that way. So that's kind of like a very brief sketch, but that's how I would kind of, characterize that. And then if you want to add anything, Sam, please do, because I know you've also seen some of that up front too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you shared. And I'll just add like that like tap of money that just has been flowing into Silicon Valley. It reinforces all of the things that you're sharing. The idea that these Silicon Valley bro tech founders are gods. You start to believe that when you get all of the money that you ask for, and everyone is on board. You have the media that is supporting your vision, because because you've essentially bought the media. And so like that is really key. And I want to talk too about like the surveillance piece, because this goes back to advertising and just like the origins of big tech in general, is like how people are followed around the internet, is really designed to, quote, understand the user. And why do we want to understand the user? It is so that they can profit off of us as much as possible. And so now, after however many years we have had digital advertising, we're kind of at that kind of end point of uber surveillance, because of that kind of slow trickle of them really kind of manipulating our digital ecosystems, through like social media, and understanding, what we like, what we want to consume, and really pushing that. We are seeing kind of the flip side of that now in the federal government, with government employees. You see how they are really trying to overwhelm, make people feel lesser, feel down about their work. And that's by design to either force people to quit or demoralize the entire US government workforce. Um, do you want to talk a little bit about that too, around like the difference, like this kind of chasm between the big tech leader and then kind of everyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think really well said, and I just also want to point out that this surveillance capitalism model that you're talking about, like nobody wants this.
Yes.
No user or customer wants this. There are, I'm not, I mean, I'm making a broad generalization, but like because there are people who are like, ooh, the possibilities. But most users, most people who are subjected to this type of surveillance capitalism, like we don't want this. It's very clear. It's bipartisan. The vast majority of Americans who are subject to sort of big tech surveillance capitalism, like we don't want our information about our personal health care, leaked and exploited and extracted and then sold to data brokers and identity thieves. Like none of us want that. It's terrible. It's bad. It's not healthy. It's really corrosive and bad for our young people, for our kiddos,
Mm.
big and small, teens, middle school, et cetera, like to grow up in a world in which that is a norm. And most of us don't have, private schools that are $30,000 a year, and teams of lawyers that are worth millions to go out and deal with the problems that come with that, right?
Right.
Most of us are just regular people. Um, so it's not something that we want, that model. And then I think, and maybe this is sort of a good place to potentially kind of come in and talk a little bit about sort of Elon Musk and his, sort of quid pro quo, attitude and some of the tactics that he gets into. But I think the thing to sort of, bring to the forefront is that, essentially it's about domination and control, like
Mhm.
at the very base layer. um, it's not that, when I go back to what I was describing about Silicon Valley, it's not that founders or startup executives are not capable, or they're not allowed to share power and to build trust and to make balanced decisions and to create structure. It's just like not incentivized in that world. And, there's a whole other set of things there I'm not going to get into, but like when you go and look at some of this kind of like tactical stuff that Elon Musk is doing and that the people around him and the Trump administration are doing, let's just sort of be really clear. This is about bullying people. This is about abusing, harassing, and humiliating people. And every terrible sort of startup tech story that you can go back and look at for the last 20 years comes from that same foundational place. And I think that's something we just have to say really straight up. And so now, like, as you're pointing to, they're bringing that playbook to the federal government, and they're doing it with taxpayer money and time and energy, which is pretty disturbing.
Yes, that is an understatement. And I think what I want to like talk about here is like Elon Musk has worked for years to cultivate an image for himself. And he has been very successful about cultivating that image, but that image has always been a lie. Because when we look at his work practices, they're very similar to Donald Trump's. He has been sued in California for harassment of Black and brown workers. He, forced workers to work through COVID because he didn't believe that it was real. And it would hurt his profits. He needs to make his trillions of dollars. Um, and so this is something that he has always been like, he really believes of himself as this kind of God, as this person who is meant to essentially rule the world. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but like we talk about the hierarchy, like we can name that as white supremacy, and his need to, have a world that is dominated by white men. So that's a little more extreme, and I can definitely go into some of the history of like Elon Musk and his businesses. But this is something that he's now, bringing into the federal government. You want to just kind of like lay the land of like what he has started doing in these first 30 days.
Yeah, I mean, the playbook is like pretty strikingly similar to what he, as you're noting, has done for the last 20 to 30 years of his career. um he's weaponizing non-disclosure agreements. So, in cases in the past where Elon Musk has been credibly accused of sexual harassment and abuse, you know, he's leveraging buyout. This is people who are employed for him. Especially, there's probably a whole other world I could get into outside of that, but it's like, for example, women that he's had some type of relationship with, or maybe even kids with. He's leveraged non-disclosure agreements and buyouts. Like, you get some money, but you can't say anything ever again. You can't reveal any of the potential abuse or discrimination or
Mm-hmm.
whatever the case might have been. So, tools like NDAs, buyouts, threatening lawsuits, or even just filing lawsuits, as whether he believed that they were going to work or not, but just as like a tool of bullying behavior. That's very common. I think also like the access journalism piece is another thing that we are kind of seeing. Like, there's no PR team at Twitter, and there's no PR team at Doge either, right? It's just like Elon Musk sort of tweeting, and there's a whole side conversation there about how he has decided that the news about the government that the American people are paying for just should come out on Twitter, which is basically his version of state-run media. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's another kind of abusive tactic. We don't respond to reporters, but we put out propaganda on our own channels. And if you don't come to that, you won't get access at all, right? Which of course is next to, you have to say nice things about us, like we're amazing and innovative and wonderful. And our dad and grandparents weren't super pro-apartheid, anti-Semitic, figures, which in Musk's case is absolutely accurate. So all the sort of like tactical things that you see with that kind of bullying billionaire behavior are now sort of showing up, and he's doing all that stuff to, honestly, to people who work at the FAA who are just trying to keep air travel safe, and to folks who work at the NNSA, National Nuclear Security Administration, trying to make sure that whether you agree with nuclear weapons or different uses of nuclear materials, like just making sure that we're aware of and paying attention to, monitoring and maintaining safety standards is like a pretty important piece. So those are just two examples. There's a lot of other stuff out there too. But those tactics are things that Elon Musk is sort of bringing to bear. And then, of course, he's also creating an opening for himself and his companies to sort of insert in that space and be like, oh, we'll fix it. We'll just take the billions of taxpayer dollars to fix the problem that we created. And that's also a very Silicon Valley kind of tech tactic to do.
Yeah. Yes. Destroy industries and then pretend like you're coming in to save them. Um, yeah, and I think like two things I want to touch on. One is like this idea of like the one app to rule them all. There's this like obsession in Silicon Valley, and I'm like really just in the last few days starting to see Elon Musk really try to implement this with the federal government, which is wild to think about. But the whole idea is like, why have an open and free internet? We should just have one app that does everything. It is your social media. It is your, maps. It's your finance and all of this. And so that's exactly what he's doing. He is saying, the any government news and communication comes through X, Twitter, and he's starting to talk about, financing and crypto, and really funneling like an Elon crypto coin into the government. So I think that is something that's like very much something that we should watch out for, because, we see that if the seeds start coming, like most likely that is his vision, because his vision is really like, how do I enact my worldview onto everyone?
Yeah, how to become the global leader, the
Yep.
president of the universe,
Yep.
the galactic king of the galaxy. Which sounds like sort of a crazy thing to say out loud, but like, you know, those are his contemporaries are also thinking those same things. Like,
Right.
Mark Zuckerberg at some point, a few years ago was starting to kind of advance that notion of like Facebook as this sort of town square. And there was some talk about him running for president, maybe like having those aspirations and having talked to his group of peers about that like that, and then cryptocurrency sort of coming up in the 2017-ish realm and now continuing to be nurtured, even though a lot of it is a scam and not, really helpful or useful or innovative or of value at all to most people. Those things are all sort of about, colonial kind of dominance ultimately. And that's what these guys believe in. And even if you go back to like, here's a deep cut. If you go back to like the Edge dinners, and for
Mm.
people who are not familiar with Edge dinners, that's like a series of billionaire dinners that were hosted in and around Silicon Valley. And if you go look at some of the photos, guess who appears in those photos as some of our favorite people, a certain Jeffrey fellow, a certain Bill Gates fellow, a certain Elon and Mark and these other people, common to see these billionaires in those places. And their dreams, that they have had are much of what you are just describing in terms of sort of like one app to rule them all. It's like really just their dream of sort of being in control of everyone and everything. They're not really interested in creating value for the end user or the customer. Like that's the thing that they say, but the thing that they want is sort of goes back to that early like founder as the glorified God kind of thing. Which I guess makes sense, right? Using like a Zuckerberg example, he just wanted to be able to see photos of girls at the dorms at Harvard.
Right.
And that, that really hasn't actually changed that much.
No. And I mean, I think Mark Zuckerberg is such a good example too, because with all due respect to the human Mark Zuckerberg, like he is not a creative or innovative person. Nothing
No,
about
and the VR products are terrible. I mean, I've been
terrible.
on like some of the stuff he's come up with, you're like, wow, that's some of the worst and least adopted products that you are burning the most money I've ever seen. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. I
No,
just had
no,
to
I
say.
love it. Yes. I mean, yes, he has bought everything that has ever been successful in Meta, WhatsApp, Instagram, and everything that he has like put all of his chips on. Like, why is Meta called Meta? Like, Meta isn't a thing anymore. We don't talk about the metaverse because no one wanted to live in Mark Zuckerberg's little world. And I think like that's where, we do have to be really clear and specific when we are talking about these things, especially within our like organizing groups, within our like more intimate groups, because what I'm seeing, and like, it comes as no surprise that like the media is talking about this like it is a surprise. Um, we know what the Silicon Valley ethos is, and it is white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. It is colonialism. It is we must dominate. We have the right answer to the world, and therefore we are going to enact that on everyone. And like, even though we are in a different era and they wear, you know, vests and, whatever Mark Zuckerberg wears is his ridiculous curly hair and his surfer bro attitude, like at the end of the day, these are still white supremacists and we need to call that out, and be very clear about what they are trying to do so that we can then move forward and actually create that action.
Yeah, and I think it points at two things which are really important, and I won't go super deep, but I think they're worth mentioning is like one is when people like, Elon Musk and Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI, and some of these other kind of like titans of sort of tech in Silicon Valley, like when they talk about creating sort of beneficial tech that's good for the future of humanity, they often talk about like AGI or artificial intelligence, which is like this idea that like there would be this general AI that could just sort of take over and control, and that doesn't exist, and it's a long way off, but they're using that as a distraction from the fact that they want to control everything and everyone, and like sort of have the decision making about what is important, or what the narratives are. And and that comes from that place of like we are gods. It comes from a long history of eugenics and other kind of like segregationist and racist thinking and acting. And I would just also be remiss if I didn't mention, like, I think for folks who have not run across it, like, you absolutely required reading Dr. Timnit Gebru, who used to work at Google on AI work, and her co-author Emil Torres wrote a fantastic piece of research last year called the TESCREAL Bundle. I think it was just about sort of eugenics and the promise of like this utopia through artificial
Mm.
general intelligence, something like that. Go look it up. The TESCREAL Bundle is sort of the short name. It's a must read because it really connects 20 to 30 years of Silicon Valley history, including researchers that worked at Stanford and other notable places that sort of like laundered this concept with that we're talking about through all these institutions and all of these venture capital funds, et cetera. And I'm a person who's worked in tech and startups, and I see the good and the bad. I mean, it's a mixed bag, but the part of it that's darkest and scariest and most dangerous is the part we're talking about, which comes from this like, this is not about, make no mistake, like there's no reason to talk about efficiency or DEI here. This is about segregation. That's what people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and other people are bringing to their efforts to reform. And by reform, I mean take over the federal government.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just been thinking a lot about Peter Thiel and Elon Musk as, South African. And you know, we talk a lot about the history of South Africa, but I think we only talk about, apartheid mainly. And I think we really need to be clear about like the long history of racism in South Africa. Because Elon Musk is an Afrikaner, which means that he is a white person who immigrated to South Africa from the Dutch Republic, which is through the transatlantic slave trade. And they, you know, that's the start of all of this if we really look at that. And so I think it's really important to look at the history and to go that far back. These guys, they talk about the Roman salute, which we know is a Nazi salute, but Nazis, Romans, like we have to look at the threads of history because all of this is not new. It has been done before and they're using a playbook, and we can look at that playbook and we can disrupt that playbook.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think a good example of that is like the defining factor when we look at these sort of like pretty pivotal moments in history in Germany in the 1930s. You've got other examples, Bosnia Herzegovina, when you're looking at genocide in the 90s. I'm not an expert on all these areas, but I certainly read about and pay attention to these things because it's important to watch and know what happens. But in these cases where you have these sort of takeovers of the state apparatus, and then sort of this destruction, and I think Putin in Russia would be another pretty good example of like taking over the state and then just sort of weakening all of the best parts of the democracy and the trust and the care and the community, and just like all the things that are good about a place and a nation. When we look at those examples, past and present, they all have these hallmarks of what we're talking about, where it really is about these sort of figures trying to control everything. And, that's dangerous on a number of levels, but especially I think because it requires the silence and the participation of a big middle group of people who are like, well, I'm not really a Nazi. Like, I don't think he made a Nazi salute. A lot of people are saying that about the Roman salute that our dear friend Elon Musk made. Like, well, he didn't do it. He did it to other. He sent that to a specific group of people, most likely,
Yeah.
and he also figured that a certain pretty large group of people would just like wish that it wasn't true or just kind of deny it away. And there's a reason that he uplifts Holocaust deniers quite regularly on his channels and his Twitter feed and things like that. And ultimately, tactically, like we should all be very careful about that, but especially for people who feel like they're kind of in that middle ground, and we need to move people so that they don't stay silent in these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that kind of like leads to my last question, which is, like what do we do as organizers, activists, working in nonprofits? Like a lot of that funding is threatened. I think a lot of people feel just like the ground beneath them is very uncertain right now. But they, we all see what is happening, and I think there is that energy to want to do something, and like what I love is like that you're talking about this kind of middle group of people that can be activated. But I think the question is, how do we activate those folks who, aren't really even used to organizing in this moment?
It's a good question. I think there are probably different answers, and so I'm very curious to hear your perspective on it because I know this is an area of like deep practice for you. My sort of, if I were to boil it into like three things, for me those three things would be: one, like real organizing, not on the internet. I mean, the internet can be used for that purpose, but I think need we need shared agreements and shared trust around the things that we're talking about. And so I think real literal organizing is important. And I don't just mean physically. I mean, to some extent that's very true, but I think also like, smaller groups, smaller, more personal, more direct advocacy and organizing. And I think that organizing has to be about reinforcing people and community. And it can't just be like, this is politics organizing, because we are dealing with something that goes well beyond politics, right? It's culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much bigger problem. And it's also a much bigger opportunity, of course, too, in that sense. So I think that's one thing, is like real on the ground organizing that probably can't be taking place out in the open. The results of that organizing do need to be visible, because I think that strength and that visibility and symbolism is very important here. I think that's the second thing is like that, the results of that real organizing and, getting from 10 people to do something up to 50 to 150, we're just not going to go from dozens to hundreds to thousands overnight. I think that practicing and warming up that muscle is really important. And I think organizations that are thinking about what to do next, that care about the stuff we're talking about, need to be practicing warming that muscle up, and then thinking about what and when to make that visible. Because we will not be tweeting our way out of this situation. I don't think that's the case. I mean, it plays a role, but it's not going to happen. And then the third thing, I think it really is just knowing that the reason that this gap is here and that these sort of Elon Musk figures have stepped into it is because we have an overfocus on hyper individualism and consumerism, and we're trying to solve community problems and isolation and things that are like very deep, long level, big problems.
Mhm.
We can't solve that shit with an app or an Amazon order. Like, it ain't going to happen. I'm not trying to be rude to anybody, because, take care of yourself, get your rest, zone out when you need to zone out. But like, there's a reason why this is working for them, right? It's because a lot of us are sort of in that place of like, where we're sleeping a little bit on the job. And, and I'll give an example, which we were talking about a little bit before we hopped on the podcast, was like, people are sort of like, we need to boycott Tesla. And I think that actually is true, but there's a difference between the performance version and the real fucking serious. Sorry, I curse, as you know.
No, go for it.
The real fucking serious version. The serious version is getting a ton of people to sell their Teslas and taking a little bit of a loss, because you might have to do that, and getting a different EV, and also being publicly straightforward about why they made that decision. The difference is dropping the market cap of Tesla by a bunch of billions. Like, that actually would be a fairly effective thing if it's organized, and strong, right? And I also hear, I'm very appreciative of the NCAA, NAACP's, college sports got
It's
in my
like,
head
wow,
for a second there. Hopefully, maybe the NCAA can pick up on this
that
and
would
do
be
something with
great.
it. Yeah, because the NAACP did, they have a boycott list
Mhm.
of businesses that are really hostile and segregationist.
Mhm.
I'm going to frame that really clearly. Like, these businesses are laying off and firing Black and Latino and Indigenous and Asian employees and others, any non-white employees. And they're framing it as a response to this DEI worries and fears and risks. And I'm like, no, you're lumping in with the segregationists. And so, like, that campaign that NAACP is doing is really effective and useful in that way. And I think more people should pick that up. And so, again, just being like really thinking about what real organizing is like. And it's okay to do it small if it's effective. It doesn't have to scale all the damn time. That's a
Mhm.
Silicon Valley myth. So those are my sort of top of mind thoughts. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Sam, in terms of organizing?
Yeah, no, I love that. I was thinking like you can't bath bomb your way out of fascism. So yes, like I think that you hit on like the deeper part of, the organizing, not just tactics of like what do we do right now, which I think, for organizations, for activists, for organizers, what I would say right now is like the time is to build community, to connect, and to strategize. We were talking, it does take time to build, and that is okay. The urgency is here, but the urgency was here before the election. And so if we build strategically and through community with those values that really combat white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, like the solution to individualism is community, and like let's lean into that. So from like a tactical perspective, I would just say like strategize, have those meetings, have those hard conversations so that when the thing happens for your organization or your, cause, you're ready to act. But from that macro perspective, like, yes, we need to rebuild the connections. Like I think you're kind of explaining that a lot of our muscles have atrophied, and they've atrophied because of big tech. I actually put in the newsletter last week that OpenAI, they did a Microsoft study that if you use OpenAI too much, your literal critical thinking skills go down. And we see that, with social media, depression, anxiety, these things are breeding these for us. And so the solution to the individualism that big tech cultivates is for us to reconnect to what community really truly is. And so your point around like that kind of slow building, I think we should look at like little wins and stair steps. What are the ways to build that kind of middle ground of people who care but don't know what to do? Like, what are the ways to kind of build that small map for them to get onto the road? Because we frankly haven't given people maps, and I think that's why we are where we are. When I was out on the road in the election, like I had a lot of folks who were like, I didn't vote, or I only voted at the top of the ticket because like I don't know who these people are, I don't know. And it's like they're not supposed to know, they're busy, they're going about their lives. Like that is our job, is to give that support to people. And so I think, rebuilding those muscles and thinking outside of the systems that we've had.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's like those opportunities are really there right now
Yeah.
in this moment. I mean, there are scientists and researchers who are banding together to create archives of important research and studies and data that, that Elon and his merry band of idiot hackers are just like getting rid of, decades of important research about diabetes. And they're just like turning off whole websites and deleting databases, which I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole other cup of tea. But like, there are people banding together to create archives of that, and if that's something that is like, that's something people can get behind, right? That take action, get into that place. There are people who are banding together to make sure that there's resources and legal support for federal workers who are being illegally laid off by an unelected billionaire king. Like a lot of this shit is illegal, and there are people banding together for those. Like that's a great place to pitch in and make sure that people not just sharing the resources, but like really checking in and figuring out how can we support the federal workers in our community who work for the Forest Service and keep protecting our wildfire risks, and the people who work at the National Weather Service and they do forecasting for droughts. Like these are extreme risks in our communities here in New Mexico, California, certainly the case, Montana, Wyoming, I mean, Texas. Like, these are all, there's a lot of different concerns in different places, but like the things that Elon Musk and Trump and the people around them are doing are things that have a lot of real world impacts for all of us, and we should be organizing around that. And there are a lot of places to do that work and to pitch in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I interviewed the organization Get Free, which I think is going to come out a week from this. But they are a youth-led organization, and they definitely have a plan for the first 100 days, and it's all about building that kind of cookie crumbs to action. Um, because I think, folks are ready. We just got to get them off the couch and off of the TikToks.
Yeah, yeah. The revolution will not be televised first, and I'm not qualified to build on anything that Kendrick Lamar does in general, and certainly not this brilliant Super Bowl sort of performance. But like, I think the dynamic of like, I was talking a little about it earlier, but like, the revolution will not be televised first. And the reason I say that is because everything we just talked about with Elon Musk and this whole situation in Silicon Valley, like, they're going to control a lot of these narratives. And, a lot of our mainstream news publications they don't have the muscle for this situation that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And a lot of our platforms are suppressing people's voices: TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, Meta, Instagram, and that'll continue to happen. Those things will happen. But like, if we can learn about like how to move, to your point, and warm up and in some cases rebuild those muscles, they won't have a choice but to pay attention to it, right? I think that's like the configuration that we have to be aware of. And that's it's hard work, but it can be done.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a moment where we're the heroes that we've been waiting for. And like, we're very clearly seeing that any type of leadership is just not going to be the answer. And that is okay. Big tech is all about hierarchy, and our organizations and our organizing doesn't have to be. Like, we have brilliance in our organizations and organizing movements, and like, let's lean into that and listen to folks from all across the spectrum.
Yeah, and I want to say one other thing because I don't want to go too detailed on this, and we can kind of wrap it up here a little bit on the topic. But we talked about this a little bit, Sam. But like, I just want to say from some of the work I do, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, but I do have sort of, a line of sight into, some of the people who are pretty big foundations and people that move money around elections and democracy, as well as nonprofits and social impact spaces and things like that. And, I don't work in politics. I'm adjacent to it in terms of kind of monitoring misinformation and paying attention to sort of communications around that stuff. But in both of those spaces, I do not see, they don't have answers. The people with the money and a lot of the historical and kind of like embedded power, like the general sort of vibe coming out of that is they're like still talking about what to do,
right.
and they're hoping that someone will come up with a brilliant plan. And if they had an idea about what to do, and I'm talking really bluntly here, like, but if they had an idea about what to do, I think we would already know it.
Mm,
So this is about a people's movement, and moving those people, politicians, in the middle or on the center left or center right or whatever, moving those people and moving people who have money, foundations and family offices and things like that, institutional investors, moving those people is only going to come from a people's movement. They're not going to come up with these answers by themselves, to your point. And I think we should just be really straightforward about that, what that means.
yeah, absolutely. There's a reason that the Roots of Change Agency is independent, and why I went and drove across the Southwest for the Roots of Change Agency and not the Democratic Party, because they were not interested in real organizing. It's much more about that kind of flashy storytelling. So we know the answers. They are here. They're rooted in community. They are rooted in Indigenous knowing. I've talked this month, we're talking about Black and Indigenous solidarity in our movements. And so definitely go check that out too. We talk about Kendrick's amazing performance and how it relates to elite capture and what we do about it. So there's a lot going on right now, but I really do feel like we're moving in that right direction. And it feels a little rocky, but I think with patience and with some organizing, we've got this.
Yeah. Yeah, fully agree. The path ahead is, it's going to be hard work,
Yeah.
but it can be done.
Yeah. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
I think the one thing I will say, which is really just the tip of the hat to you, Sam, is that the conversation we're having and all the conversations that you steward and your workshops and your training and your resources and your guides are really on point. They're extremely like focused and directed. And so for, I'm glad to be a guest, of course, and a recurring guest, but like for people who are, really trying to like get themselves in motion in the ways that we're talking about, like subscribe, become a paid subscriber to Sam's work, make sure to send the Roots of Change to other folks. I do it all the time. I'm in the DMs being like, you should really, this is a place to put a little bit of your funds because it's hard work what you do, Sam, and it's much needed. So I just wanted to make sure to tap on that for our listeners. Like, this is really important work, and putting it all together in the way that you do is really a lot of time and energy, and people should pay you for that because it's much needed.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we actually are celebrating our 4th anniversary the day before
That's right.
it debuts. So I can't
Yes.
believe it. We've
Yes.
been an entrepreneur for 4 years.
Congrats. That's no small thing.
Yes, we're still here, but would love your support as we grow, because we can grow together and we can move past these harmful systems.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll have you back on. And I know this was very U.S. focused, but the U.S. unfortunately is very influential on the globe, and I'm sure we'll have some more kind of global conversations too. But
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up conversation on a lot of the stuff we're talking about here as it relates to like some shifts in positioning like globally, because everything that we talked about fits in the context of a global sort of far right movement. And there's a lot of other stuff there, and and people are going to move differently, and they're about to move differently, I think, in a lot of places because of what the US has sort of opened the door to, unfortunately.
yes, absolutely.
Whole other cup of tea.
Yeah, we'll be back for all of that another time. So thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for listening.
Always a pleasure, Sam.